The morning had a particular kind of quiet that Daniel Marsh had learned to distrust. Not the absence of sound. Nora generated enough noise for 3 people before 7 in the morning, but the absence of weight. Those mornings when nothing pressed on his chest the moment he opened his eyes, when the apartment felt almost spacious instead of just small, when the grief that had taken up permanent residence in the left side of his ribcage seemed to shift just enough to let him breathe normally. Those mornings always preceded something. He stood at the kitchen counter in a gray t-shirt and dark jeans, listening to the particular rhythm of Nora getting herself halfway ready. The thud of one shoe hitting the floor. A 30-second silence. The thud of the second shoe, which for reasons he had never successfully investigated, always took longer than the first. He had mapped the acoustics of her morning routine so completely that he could tell exactly where she was in the apartment without moving from this spot. The coffee maker finished its cycle. He poured one mug, held it with both hands, and looked at the second mug he had already set out on the counter beside it. He did this every morning without thinking. 2 mugs, 2 places, the muscle memory of a life that no longer existed. He picked up the second mug, opened the cabinet, put it back. 3 years, and the habit still had not broken. He wasn't sure he wanted it to. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing one shoe and carrying the other, her dark hair everywhere at once, her school uniform already somehow wrinkled, despite having been laid out flat the night before. She studied him with the particular attention of a child who had learned to read her father's silences. "You're thinking about the party tonight?" Not a question. "I'm thinking about your hair." "My hair is fine." She dropped into the chair at the kitchen table and started pulling on her shoe. "Mrs. Dunbar said she'd do my braid before school if you're going to be late." "I won't be late." She looked up at him with an expression that was so precisely her mother's, the slight tilt of the chin, the patience worn like armor, that he had to look back at his coffee. Nora noticed. She always noticed. But she had also learned with a grace that cost her something he tried not to think about, when not to push. She reached into the front pocket of her backpack and produced a folded piece of paper, held it out across the table. He took it, opened it. She had drawn 2 figures in crayon, a tall one and a small one standing in front of what appeared to be either a stage or a very large piece of toast. Below the figures, in the careful capital letters she used when something mattered, she had written, "Seat number 1, reserved for Daddy." Something moved through his chest, slow and specific. "For tonight," she said unnecessarily. "So you don't forget which seat." "I know which seat. You forgot last time. Last time there were 2 performances and Mrs. Dunbar told me the wrong one. Mrs. Dunbar says you would forget your head if it wasn't attached. Mrs. Dunbar should focus on her own head." Nora grinned the gap from her recently lost tooth, turning the expression slightly piratical. Daniel folded the paper once carefully along its original crease and put it in the front pocket of his jacket. She watched him do it with a satisfaction she tried and failed to hide. He started making her breakfast eggs, not cereal, because she had announced 3 weeks ago that cereal was for people who had given up, and she climbed onto the counter stool and watched him cook with the focused attention she brought to things she was genuinely interested in. She had been asking to learn for months. He kept saying soon. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. "Daddy." "If helping someone hurts you, do you still help them?" He turned from the stove. She was looking at the counter, tracing a scratch in the surface with her fingertip, her expression carefully casual in the way that meant she had been thinking about this for a while. "Where did that come from?" "Nowhere. Mrs. Dunbar said it. She was talking about Mr. Dunbar and the thing with the neighbor's tree." A pause. She said, "That's how you know who a person really is, whether they help even when it costs them something." He turned back to the eggs. Outside, a car alarm somewhere in the building's parking structure started and stopped. The refrigerator made the small sound it made when the temperature cycled. "I think Mrs. Dunbar is right," he said finally. "But what if it hurts you a lot? Then you still help, and then you figure out how to handle the hurt part." Nora considered this with the gravity she applied to things that seemed important. "Okay," she said in the tone that meant she was storing it away rather than accepting it outright. Then, "Are the eggs done?" He slid them onto her plate. She ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had places to be, and he drank his coffee standing up, and neither of them said anything else about helping or hurting, and the morning continued with its particular dangerous absence of weight. He walked her to school 3 blocks away, her backpack riding high, her commentary continuous and specific, a full accounting of a dispute among her friend group involving a borrowed eraser, a lost permission slip, and what she described as a serious misunderstanding about whose turn it was to feed the class hamster. He listened and responded in the right places, and when she hit the school gate, she turned and pointed at his jacket pocket where the folded paper was. "Front row," she said. "Front row." She turned and ran, becoming immediately absorbed into the stream of children, and he watched until she disappeared through the main doors. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment after in the thin November light with the folded piece of paper in his pocket and the second mug waiting on the counter at home, and the understanding that the front row was exactly where he intended to be. He just didn't know yet what the evening had planned for him. The corporate dinner was held at a restaurant downtown that was the kind of place designed to make you feel underdressed regardless of what you wore. Dark wood low lighting, the hush of carpeting thick enough to muffle consequences. Daniel arrived at 6:45, nodded at people he recognized from the 3rd floor, found his assigned seat near the middle of the long table, not close enough to the senior leadership to matter, not far enough to be invisible, and settled in with the practiced ease of someone who had been attending these events long enough to know exactly which conversations to join and which to admire from a safe distance. He checked his watch. 3 hours until Nora's performance. Realistically, given the location, he needed to leave by 8:30 to make it comfortably. He had told Mrs. Dunbar to be at the apartment by 6, which she was. He had the route mapped. He had the front row. The room filled gradually around him. Regional directors from Atlanta and Denver, the analytics team, who always arrived in a group and sat together as though there were safety in numbers, the marketing department in their better clothes. The executive table at the far end populated last, which was always the custom. The hierarchy expressed spatially, everyone already seated and present before the people who actually made the decisions walked in. He noticed Claire Weston the moment she entered the room, which was not difficult because she was the kind of person rooms noticed. Not tall exactly, but carrying herself with the particular uprightness of someone who had spent years making sure the first thing a room understood about her was that she knew her own worth. Dark blazer, simple jewelry, nothing that called attention to itself. She had moved to Chicago 6 weeks ago to take over the fintech division, and Daniel had seen her exactly twice in that time, once at an all-hands meeting where she spoke with the precise, unhurried confidence of someone who had stopped needing to prove herself, and once in the elevator where she had been looking at her phone, and he had been invisible, which was fine. She took her seat at the executive table, exchanged brief words with the CFO on her left, and then looked briefly across the room with the expression of someone conducting a rapid environmental assessment. Her gaze moved across the tables without stopping, and when it passed over Daniel, he had the specific sensation of not being seen, which was also fine. The dinner proceeded. Appetizers, wine service, the specific social choreography of corporate events. Daniel ate, contributed to conversations when called upon, laughed in the right places, and watched his watch with the patience of someone running a private countdown. It was during the main course that he began to notice. Claire Weston was on her 3rd glass of wine, which wasn't alarming in itself. People drank at these things, that was the point, but the pace was wrong. Not celebratory drinking, not social lubrication. The kind of drinking that has somewhere specific it's trying to get. Her conversations at the executive table were still precise, still controlled, but there was something effortful about the control in a way there hadn't been 2 hours ago. He looked around the room. The CFO was deep in conversation with the head of product, fully absorbed. The other executives had drifted into their own clusters. The people who might have been paying attention to Claire Weston were all with the reliable cowardice of large organizations paying attention to something else. Daniel checked his watch. 7:50. 90 minutes until the performance. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself that Claire Weston was a capable adult who ran a division of 400 people and had presumably managed her own evenings before he arrived in Chicago. He told himself that the power imbalance alone, male subordinate female executive company event, made any intervention a minefield even under the best circumstances. He had been through a version of this once before. He knew exactly how fast a good intention could be reframed into something else. He knew it better than most people in this room knew anything. He looked away, talked to the woman on his left about the analytics rollout, ate the last of his dinner, checked his watch, 8 o'clock. When he looked back at the executive table, Claire's glass was empty again and she was reaching for the bottle, and the small invisible thing that she was holding together with visible effort seemed to be requiring more effort than it had a moment ago. She set down the bottle and her hand wasn't entirely steady. He thought about Nora's voice that morning, whether they help even when it costs them something. He had answered that question as though it were abstract. He had meant it that way. He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Dunbar. She picked up on the second ring, her voice carrying the particular warmth and judgment she deployed in equal measure. He explained that something had come up at the dinner, that he might not make the beginning of the performance, that he needed her to take Nora to the school early and sit with her until he arrived. The pause before she responded was precisely calibrated. "She's been talking about that front row seat since Tuesday, Daniel." His throat did something complicated. "I know. I'm just saying. I know. I'll get there as soon as I can." Another pause. Then Mrs. Dunbar, who had known him long enough to understand that when he said something had come up, it was rarely nothing. "All right, I'll take her." He hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand and the weight of what he'd just done settling in alongside the knowledge that it was the right thing and the awareness that those two facts coexisted without canceling each other out. He wasn't the only person who could help. He was the only person who was going to. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the bar. He kept his distance, positioned himself at a slight angle, close enough to be immediately available, far enough to not appear as if he was approaching. He watched her pour a fifth glass with a carefulness that was the opposite of steady, and then he moved, placing himself beside her with the deliberate casualness of someone who happened to be getting a drink. "Ms. Weston." Quiet, neutral, not a summons. She looked up, her eyes focused on him with a slight delay that told him more than the wine glass had. She was further along than he'd estimated from across the room. "You're from—" She paused, searching. "Operations." "Daniel Marsh. Facilities operations, 3rd floor." "Right." She looked at her glass. "Right. Is there someone I can call for you? A friend? A car service?" The flash of something across her face, not anger exactly, more the reflex of someone who had spent years making sure no one saw this particular thing. "I'm fine." "Of course." He didn't move away. "If you needed a number for a car, I could find one." "I said I'm fine." Then a moment later, quieter. "I just moved here. I don't." She stopped, set down the glass. "I can't remember my address." I can't remember my exact address." A short, bitter sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 6 weeks in and I still don't have it memorized. Incredible." Her phone, he noticed, was dark on the bar beside her. He reached over and touched the screen out of pure instinct. Dead. He looked around the room once more. The CFO was still absorbed in conversation. The executives were still carefully looking elsewhere. The bartender was polishing glasses with the focused neutrality of someone being paid not to have opinions. He thought very clearly and without embellishment about what could happen to a woman in this condition if the wrong car arrived, about wrong streets and wrong decisions made by other people. He thought about this with the specific, unromantic clarity of someone who had spent years in facilities management and had therefore seen what buildings and cities did to people who were briefly unable to protect themselves. Then he stopped thinking about it because he had already made the decision. "My apartment is 10 minutes from here," he said. "You can sleep it off. I'll stay in my daughter's room. You'll be safe." She looked at him. Behind the fog, something assessing, something that was still, despite everything, conducting its own security evaluation. "I don't know you." "Daniel Marsh, 3rd floor. There'll be a note with everything on the table when you wake up. My name, my employee number, the address. My daughter will be home, she's 8. Mrs. Dunbar will be with her." He paused. "You don't have to trust me. You just have to not have another option. Do you have another option?" A long moment. The restaurant hummed around them, indifferent. "No," she said. The word cost her something. He could see that. "Okay." He picked up her clutch from the bar. "Can you walk?" "I can walk." She straightened, and for a moment the old authority came back, the posture, the set of the jaw, and then it didn't, and she was just a woman at a bar who needed help getting home and had no one else to ask. He guided her toward the exit with one hand just above her elbow, not touching a directional presence rather than physical support. He did not look around to see who was watching. He did not check to see if anyone from the executive table had noticed them leaving. He had learned from experience that checking created the appearance of guilt, and he had also learned that experience of a certain kind left marks that changed how you moved through the world. They were almost to the door when he registered peripherally the brief flash of a phone camera from somewhere to his left. He didn't turn to look. He filed it. He kept walking. Outside, the November air was sharp enough to be useful. He had called a car from the restaurant, his own account, his name, his card, a record that would exist independently of his memory. Claire walked beside him to the curb with the careful concentration of someone navigating in conditions they weren't accustomed to, and he stayed close enough to catch her if she needed it, and far enough to make the distance legible to anyone watching. In the back of the car she was quiet for several blocks, and then she wasn't. He pulled over twice. Both times he got out, opened her door, stood back at a respectful distance while she was sick in the dark at the edge of the road, and when it was done, he handed her the water bottle. He had stopped at a gas station to buy a small errand that would leave a timestamp and a receipt in his jacket pocket, both of which he was registering with a part of his mind that had learned to document as reflex. He handed her the water and looked at the road and said nothing about what had just happened, because there was nothing useful to say about it. At some point, leaning back against the seat with her eyes closed, she said, "I don't want anyone to see me like this." He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because the sentence was carrying two different weights at once, and he wasn't sure which one she meant, and either way, there was nothing he could offer that wouldn't sound like either a dismissal or a promise. He drove the rest of the way without talking. His apartment building had a parking lot that was well lit by design. He had requested the maintenance on those particular lights personally 6 months ago, after Nora mentioned she didn't like the walk from the car to the lobby at night. The timestamp on the lot's security camera would show the car arriving at 9:47. He noted this, the way he noted the receipt in his pocket and the car service record on his phone. Not paranoia. Architecture. The architecture of the man who had once watched good intentions become evidence of something else and had not forgotten the lesson. He helped her inside, one hand cupping her elbow, minimal functional nothing that could be read as anything other than exactly what it was. They took the elevator. The hallway camera would have them at 9:52. His apartment was dark. Mrs. Dunbar had taken Nora to the school already, which meant his daughter was sitting in a folding chair backstage in her costume, scanning the wings for a father who wasn't there yet, holding the knowledge that the front row seat was waiting. He set that thought carefully to one side. He would have to carry it later, but not yet. He guided Claire to the couch, helped her sit, and stepped back immediately. Found a spare blanket in the hall closet, filled a glass with water, set 2 aspirin on the coffee table, located a clean pair of sweatpants and an oversized flannel shirt from his own drawer. Her dress was silk and had not survived the evening, and left them folded on the end of the couch without comment. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and wrote the note. He wrote it by hand on a piece of paper torn from the notepad Nora used for her drawings in printing, clear enough that it could be read without effort by someone who had just woken up in a strange place. He wrote his full name, his employee number, the floor he worked on. He wrote the address of the apartment. He wrote the time. He wrote, "You are here because you could not get home safely. I slept in my daughter's room. She is 8 years old. Mrs. Dunbar is with her. Nothing happened. There is water and aspirin on the table. Your phone is charging on the table beside this note." He read it back twice. Thought about what he would need to know if he were the one waking up. Added his personal cell number at the bottom. He plugged in her phone, set it on the table beside the note screen up visible from the couch. Then he picked up his own phone and looked at the time. 9:58. The performance started at 9. By now, Nora had already walked out onto that stage, had already scanned the audience for the front row, had already found the empty seat. He knew this the way he knew the acoustics of her morning routine, not with hope, but with the flat, certain knowledge of someone who had been paying attention. He set his phone face down on the kitchen table, walked to Nora's room, moved her stuffed animals carefully to the side, and lay down on the floor with the extra blanket from the closet. The ceiling was covered in glow-in-the-dark star stickers that Nora had applied in what she described as a scientifically accurate configuration and which bore no relation to any known constellation. He looked at them for a while. He had done everything right. He knew this with the same flat certainty he knew everything else. The note, the distance, the timestamps, the receipt in his pocket. He had built a record around tonight the way you built a retaining wall. Not because you expected the flood, but because you had seen what happened to foundations when water came and there was nothing to hold it back. And still Nora was somewhere in a school auditorium in her costume scanning the wings, and the front row seat was empty. His phone buzzed on the kitchen table. He heard it from the floor of his daughter's room. He didn't get up. A few minutes later it buzzed again. He still didn't move. Then he heard the door, the particular click of Mrs. Dunbar's key in the lock, her careful entry the way she always paused just inside to give the apartment a moment to register her presence. Footsteps. Then smaller footsteps, lighter and faster, and then the sound of Nora stopping somewhere in the living room because she had seen the figure on the couch. He got up, came out into the hallway. Nora stood in the middle of the living room in her performance costume, white dress, silver sash, the small rhinestone clip in her hair that she had borrowed from Mrs. Dunbar's jewelry box. Her eyes moved from the sleeping woman on the couch to her father in the hallway with the careful, comprehensive gaze of a child cataloging new information. "Who is that?" Not accusatory, genuinely uncertain. "Someone from work who got sick." He kept his voice low. "She needed somewhere safe to sleep." Nora studied the sleeping woman for another moment. Then she looked back at him, and in her expression he could see her assembling the equation, the empty seat, the front row, the woman on the couch, the performance she had given to an audience that did not include him. He watched her finish the calculation. "You missed my song, Daddy." The words landed precisely where they were aimed. "I know, sweetheart. You said you'd be in the front row." "I know I did." She didn't cry. That was almost harder than if she had the absence of tears. The straightening of her small spine, the way she nodded once like she was filing something away under a category she was still building. She was learning what Daniel had spent 15 years learning, that adults sometimes broke promises for reasons that were real, and that being real didn't make the breaking easier. Mrs. Dunbar appeared behind her and touched her shoulder gently. "Let's get you out of that dress, sweetheart." Nora went with her, and at the door of her room she paused and looked back at her father one more time, and then she was gone. Daniel stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back into Nora's room, moved the stuffed animals again, lay back down on the floor. The glow-in-the-dark stars pulsed faintly in the dark. He lay there running through every decision he had made in the last 4 hours, checking them the way you checked the load-bearing elements of a structure you were about to walk across. The note, the distance, the timestamps, the record, Mrs. Dunbar as witness, his daughter as unimpeachable evidence of the apartment's real geography that night. Everything was documented. Everything was appropriate. Everything could be accounted for. He lay there and knew with a certainty that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with experience that it didn't matter. It didn't matter what he had done. It mattered what she believed when she woke up. His phone buzzed again from the kitchen table. He reached over to the nightstand, Nora's nightstand stickered with cartoon animals and one inexplicable image of a tractor, and picked up his own phone to silence it. The message on the screen was from an unknown number. He looked at it for a long time in the dark. The text was 4 words. "Remember what happened last time." Below it a photograph. Him and a woman outside the parking structure of his old company 3 years ago, a moment he recognized with the specific stomach-dropping clarity of something you have spent years trying to forget. They were standing close but not touching. She had her hand on his arm. The photo captured exactly the second that looked worst in the way that photos of innocent moments always managed to look like evidence of something else. He had helped that colleague to her car after she'd twisted her ankle on a stairwell. That was the whole story. That was the entirety of it. The investigation that followed had lasted 6 weeks, had cost him his job, had been resolved in his favor with a quiet settlement and an NDA that he had signed because he needed the money and couldn't afford the alternative. The company had called it a misunderstanding. He had called it the moment he understood that being right and being safe were two different categories with very little overlap. He put the phone face down on Nora's nightstand. Above him, the glow-in-the-dark stars traced their inaccurate constellations, and somewhere in the living room the woman who ran the fintech division slept on his couch in his clothes with no memory of how she had gotten there, and the note he had written waited on the coffee table for morning like a prayer he had composed in advance against a fear he wasn't sure he could name. He did not sleep for a long time. When he finally did, it was shallow and not restful. The kind of sleep that keeps one ear open, and when he woke at 5:47 to the pre-dawn gray coming through Nora's window, his first conscious thought was not about the woman in the living room, or the photograph on his phone, or the performance he had missed. His first thought was the note on the coffee table and whether he had written enough and whether it would matter. He already knew the answer. He had known it since the moment he lay down on this floor. But knowing and accepting were separate processes, and he was still working on the second one. The apartment was quiet. The stars on the ceiling had stopped glowing. Somewhere outside, the city was beginning its first cautious transactions with the morning, and in 6 hours he would be walking into a situation he had tried with every careful documented witnessed act of the night before to prevent. He had done everything right. That had never been the point. The note was still on the coffee table when Claire Weston woke up. She didn't read it immediately. The first 30 seconds were pure animal response, the wrong ceiling, the wrong light, the wrong particular silence of an apartment that was not hers. She sat upright with her heart already running ahead of her comprehension, taking inventory unfamiliar couch, unfamiliar blanket clothes that belonged to someone larger than her, a glass of water and 2 aspirin arranged with a deliberateness that felt in the first unfiltered moment of waking like staging, like evidence of a plan rather than evidence of care. Her phone was on the table, charged. Screen showing 6:14 in the morning and 3 missed calls from Bridget. She picked it up and dialed before she had finished reading the note. Bridget Holt answered on the second ring with the specific alertness of someone who had been half waiting. When Claire told her where she was, the words coming out in fragments, the pieces assembling badly. Bridget's voice did the thing it always did under pressure. It went quiet and flat and precise the way a scalpel was precise, which was to say without warmth and without hesitation. Don't say anything to him. Each word its own sentence. Don't apologize, don't explain. Just tell me what the note says. Claire read it. The name, the employee number, the floor, the sentence about the daughter's room, about Mrs. Dunbar, about nothing happening. She read it aloud and heard her own voice doing something uncertain with the words. Bridget was quiet for a moment. Then, men who write notes like that have thought about needing the note. That's not Bridget, there's a child's artwork on the wall. There's a backpack by the door with a unicorn on it. I know. Listen to me. I lived through something like this, Tori. The flatness in Bridget's voice had something else under it now, something that had been kept in a specific place for a long time and was leaking around the edges. I was careful too. I thought I was reading the situation correctly. I thought the details added up. And I waited too long to protect myself, and by then the narrative already existed, and I was playing catch-up inside someone else's version of events. A breath. You don't remember last night. That is not a small thing. That is the entire problem. I remember leaving the restaurant. You remember leaving. What do you remember after that? The silence that followed answered the question more completely than any words would have. Call HR when they open, Bridget continued. Don't frame it as an accusation. Frame it as documentation. You woke up in an employee's apartment with no memory of the night. You are reporting this to ensure proper protocols are followed. That is all. You are not claiming anything you can't support. You are creating a record that shows you reported immediately before any narrative had time to form, without you in it. Claire looked at the note again. The handwriting was even unhurried. The information was complete. She thought about the aspirin, the specific placement of the water glass where she would see it before she saw anything else. From somewhere down the hall a door opened. Small footsteps. And then a child appeared in the hallway, 8 years old. Dark hair still pressed flat on one side from sleep pajamas, with small elephants marching across them in confident rows. She looked at Claire with the direct, uncommitted curiosity of a person who had not yet learned to manage her own expressions. "Are you feeling better?" Her voice carried the careful enunciation of someone who had been taught to speak clearly to adults. "Daddy said you were sick." Claire stood very still. Daniel appeared behind his daughter a moment later. He was wearing the same gray shirt from the night before, his face carrying the particular flatness of someone who had not slept much and was not going to perform having slept much. He looked at Claire the way you looked at a situation you had already modeled multiple outcomes for, not without feeling, but past the point where feeling changed the analysis. "Nora, quiet. Go brush your teeth, please." The child went with one backward glance that catalogued more than it revealed. Daniel stayed where he was. Claire's eyes moved around the apartment in the light she hadn't had when she arrived, the drawings taped to the wall in a child's careful frames, the bookshelf with its family photographs, the small backpack leaning against the door with its unicorn patch worn soft from handling. On the floor beside the couch, folded with geometric precision, a blanket and a pillow. The floor. He had slept on the floor. "Ms. Weston," his voice was low, steady, carrying none of the defensiveness she had been braced for. "I know this looks bad. I know you're scared. Nothing happened last night. You were in no condition to get home. I made a call. That's all this was." The phone in her hand was still warm from the call. Bridget's voice was still in her ear, careful and flat, and born from a wound that had never properly closed. "I need to leave," Claire managed. "I'll call you a car." She waited outside the building in the November morning with her arms folded, wearing clothes that belonged to a man she barely knew. Her silk dress in a plastic bag he had found in the kitchen. When the car arrived, she got in without looking back. Then she looked back. In the window above the lobby, Nora stood watching her go with an expression Claire couldn't read from this distance and didn't try to. She told herself she was being careful. She told herself caution was not accusation. She told herself the two things were distinct and that the distinction was important. By the time the car reached her building, she was no longer entirely sure she believed herself. By the time she reached her apartment, she had stopped trying to decide and started trying to act, which was the only mode she fully trusted. She opened her laptop. She started typing. The email arrived in Elliot Graves's inbox at 9:17 on Monday morning, and by 9:45 it had generated a meeting that included 3 department heads, a representative from legal, and a growing file that Elliot was assembling, with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that the quality of the documentation was the quality of the company's position. Daniel came in at his usual time, 8:50, stopping at the front desk to sign in, exchanging 12 words with the security officer about the weekend's football results. He took the elevator to the 3rd floor. He nodded at Theo, who was already at his desk, and who met Daniel's eye with a particular expression, not quite worry, not quite warning, somewhere between them, that Daniel filed without interpreting. He had been at his desk for 20 minutes when Elliot Graves appeared. Elliot was in his late 40s, precise in the way of people who had spent long careers in HR and had learned that precision was the only available armor. He set a printed document on Daniel's desk with the careful placement of someone who understood that every physical action in these moments was potentially significant. "I need you to read this carefully." Elliot's voice carried professional neutrality, the way certain buildings carried load-bearing walls structurally and visibly everywhere at once. Daniel read it, then read it again. The language was measured and institutional, each phrase selected to convey maximum implication with minimum legal exposure. Administrative leave pending investigation. Standard procedure. Not a determination of guilt. He set the document down on his desk and looked at it for a moment. "I need to make arrangements for my daughter. You have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings. Security will escort you out." He nodded once. Then, "Am I allowed to know who filed the report?" Elliot's expression didn't move. Given the nature of the allegation, the complainant's identity is protected under company policy. He hadn't needed to ask. There was only one answer to that question, and he had known it since he woke up on Nora's floor in the pre-dawn gray and understood that good intentions were not self-defending. He had asked anyway because he wanted it on record that he had asked and that the answer had been given and that this was the shape of the process from the very beginning. He stood up and opened his desk drawer. The packing took 24 minutes. The security officer stationed at a respectful distance watched him work with the careful non-expression of someone following a protocol they hadn't written. Daniel packed Nora's photograph, first the one from her birthday in August, where she was holding a piece of cake with the specific triumph of someone who had been waiting for that moment all year. He packed the mug she had painted for him at summer camp blue and lopsided with a handprint on the side that she had pressed in with a ceremony she refused to explain. He packed the small cactus on the corner of his desk that had survived 3 years of fluorescent lighting and irregular watering through what he could only describe as personal determination. He was putting on his jacket when Theo appeared beside him, moving with the particular speed of someone who had made a decision and was acting before they could unmake it. "Danny." Low close. "I need to tell you something." Daniel looked at him. Theo's jaw was working. He was 41 years old and had played college football and still carried himself like someone who expected the ground to hold, but right now he looked like a man standing on something that had stopped feeling solid. "Friday night, when you were leaving with her, I took a picture." He pushed through the rest before Daniel could respond. "I was being paranoid on your behalf. I wanted you to have something if anyone tried to say something went wrong. I thought I was helping." The silence between them had a specific quality. Not angry exactly, but load-bearing. "Did HR contact you?" Theo's throat moved. "This morning, an hour ago." "And you gave it to them?" Not a question. Theo's face gave him the answer before any words could. Daniel picked up the cardboard box. He thought about saying something and then thought about what there was to say and decided neither of them needed more weight on this particular morning. "It's okay, Theo." "Danny, I mean it. You didn't do anything wrong." He looked at his friend directly. "Neither did I. That's what the investigation is going to find." He said it with more certainty than he felt. He said it because it was true and also because Theo needed to hear it said plainly, and also because if you named the outcome you intended to work toward, you made it slightly more real. He had learned this from Nora, who narrated her own ambitions with the confidence of someone who considered the universe a reasonable negotiating partner. He walked out of the building at 11:32 with the cardboard box under one arm and the knowledge settling in around him like weather. The financial damage came first because it was the most concrete. His overtime hours, which had been padding the gap between his salary and Chicago's rent, disappeared the moment the suspension took effect. His quarterly bonus, 3 months of work, compressed into a number that would have covered Nora's after-school program for the rest of the year, was frozen pending outcome. He had savings. He had been careful with money in the specific way of people who had learned that carefulness was the only reliable safety net available to them. But careful had limits, and careful did not account for indeterminate. He called Mrs. Dunbar that afternoon and explained without explaining. She listened and said she would continue watching Nora at her standard rate for now and they could figure out the rest later. He told her that wasn't necessary. She told him she had known him for 3 years and that she knew what was and wasn't necessary. He didn't argue because he couldn't afford to in both senses of the word. He spent the first week doing the things that needed doing. He gathered every piece of documentation he could locate that touched on Friday night, the car service receipt, the gas station receipt, the timestamp on the call to Mrs. Dunbar, the GPS record from his phone showing the route the text messages he had sent Theo throughout the evening that tracked his movements and his thinking in real time. He organized it into a file on his laptop with the methodical care of a man building a case, because that was what he was doing and pretending otherwise would have been a luxury he couldn't afford. The phone on the corner of his desk, his kitchen desk. Now the apartment, feeling different in the daytime with nowhere else to be, showed no further messages from the unknown number after Friday night. Whoever Warren Stills was in the context of his past was staying quiet, which either meant the initial provocation had served its purpose or meant something else entirely that he couldn't yet see the shape of. He had run through the list of people he had disciplined or let go in the past 3 years, and Warren Stills was not a difficult calculation. The man had been on Daniel's team for 14 months before a pattern of falsified maintenance reports became impossible to attribute to anything other than intention. Daniel had documented it carefully, escalated it through the proper channels, and the termination had proceeded without drama on the surface and apparently with considerably more drama underneath. He understood Warren, not excused him, understood him. Resentment was a simple machine. You fed it neglect and perceived injustice, and it ran indefinitely. He had encountered it before. He had never been in a position where someone else's resentment had this much leverage on his life. The social damage came second and was harder to quantify. The building's small ecosystem, the third-floor cluster who ate lunch together, the facilities team who ran on a current of informal communication, went quiet around him in the way that indicated the rumor had reached critical mass. He knew this not from direct evidence, but from the way conversations at the grocery store near his building developed odd gaps when someone recognized him, and from the way Theo's texts became shorter and more careful, as though Theo was doing his own version of documentation. He was on his third day at home when Nora came back from school with her jaw set in the specific configuration that meant she was working very hard not to show him something. He waited. He had learned that with Nora, as with most important things, waiting was more productive than asking. She held out for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than usual. Then, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework open in front of her, "Marcus said you got in trouble at work because of a lady." Daniel set down his coffee. "He said that's why you don't go there anymore." "What did you tell him?" "I told him he was wrong." A pause. "He said his mom told him. He said moms don't lie." The kitchen felt smaller than usual. He sat down across from her and looked at his daughter, who was looking at her homework with the studied neutrality of someone trying to present a question as smaller than it was. Sometimes people hear part of a story and think it's the whole story. He kept his voice level because she was reading his voice more carefully than his words, and he knew it. They're not lying. They just don't know enough. What's the real story? The real story is that I helped someone who needed help, and some people looked at that and misunderstood. Nora was quiet for a moment. Her pencil moved against the page without writing anything. Then, "Are you going to go to jail?" He pulled his chair around so he was sitting beside her, rather than across from her. She let him. He put his arm around her shoulders and felt her lean into him with the particular quality of weight that meant she was actually leaning, not performing it. "No, baby, I'm not going to jail. This is a work problem. It's going to get sorted out." She didn't say anything for a long time. He held her and looked at the homework spread on the table and waited. "The lady on the couch," Nora said finally. "Is she the one who made the problem?" He thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest without being a weight he was putting down on his 8-year-old. "She's part of it. She was scared, and when people are scared they sometimes make choices that aren't fair." Did she know she was being unfair? "I don't know." Nora absorbed this. Then, with the pragmatic accuracy that was her particular gift, she should find out. He almost said something. Didn't. Just held her a little tighter and let the kitchen be quiet around them for a while. Claire had not left her apartment in 72 hours. She told herself it was efficient, everything she needed was accessible remotely. The board meetings ran fine on video, the reports moved through email without requiring her physical presence anywhere. This was all true. It was also true that she had been in her apartment for 3 days, because leaving meant passing through a building where Elliot Graves was conducting an investigation she had started, and she was finding that considerably harder than the efficiency argument made it sound. She read every report Elliot sent. She read them with the thoroughness she brought to financial documents, tracking each piece of evidence as it arrived in the file, assembling the timeline with the specific dread of someone who already knows what the picture is going to look like and is watching it develop anyway. The restaurant security footage showed Daniel approaching Claire at the bar. He maintained consistent distance throughout their conversation. When he walked her to the exit, his hand was positioned above her elbow without contact. Directional, not possessive, the body language of someone navigating a situation they wanted to be able to account for. The parking lot camera caught them getting into the car service vehicle. His face was visible. He did not look around to check if anyone was watching, she had read enough of these situations to know the opposite of what a person covering something up looked like. His apartment building's security footage showed them arriving at 9:47. The hallway camera showed him guiding her to his apartment door with the same minimal contact, letting her enter first following. The timestamp showed the apartment lights going off at 10:04. They did not come back on until 5:49 in the morning. The GPS data from his phone traced a route that matched every detail of the note he had left. The car service receipt documented the pickup time, the route, the arrival. The gas station receipt, a small thing, almost nothing, was time-stamped 9:22, and the items purchased were a water bottle and a package of antacids. She had needed both. She sat with the gas station receipt in the file for a long time. He had pulled over twice. She remembered that much from Friday night, more sensation than narrative. He had bought water. He had waited. And then he had written it down, not in a log, not in a formal record, just in the receipt he kept in his pocket, and the timestamps that existed, because he had paid for things, rather than handling them in ways that left no trail. The careful, complete architecture of a man who had done this before. Not this specific situation, but the experience of having good intentions examined for evidence of bad ones. Her phone buzzed. "Bridget," she answered. "I saw the latest summary from Graves." Bridget's voice had the quality of someone who had moved past the emotional register of the situation into the operational one. "The evidence is looking favorable for you. No proof of wrongdoing on his part means no proof of anything against you. The company will probably settle quietly, reinstate him with back pay. Everyone signs ND as this goes away." Claire was looking at the gas station receipt on her screen. "He has a daughter." Her voice came out differently than she expected, quieter. "I know. She was there that night. She was asleep in the next room." A pause. "She asked me if I was feeling better. She said her daddy told her I was sick." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "Tori, she's 8 years old and she's being told her father did something wrong, at school, by other children. I understand that's hard to sit with, but you made the right call given what you knew at the time. You didn't know the evidence would be this clear. You were protecting yourself from a situation you couldn't evaluate." "I could evaluate it." The words arrived with a clarity that surprised her. "I looked at that apartment. I read the note. I saw where he slept. I evaluated it, and I made a choice that had nothing to do with the evidence in front of me, and everything to do with what you told me to be afraid of." The silence on the other end of the line was not comfortable. "You told me you lived through something like this." Claire kept her voice even. "And I'm sorry for whatever happened to you. I mean that. But you needed me to be in danger more than you needed to know if I actually was. That's not fair." "No." She closed the laptop. "It's not. A lot of things aren't." She hung up and sat in her apartment in the particular quiet of someone who has just made a decision that is going to cost them something and has not yet fully assessed what. She opened her laptop again and navigated to a blank email. The recipient field waited. She thought about Nora standing in the window as the car drove away. She thought about the way the child had watched her go, not angry, not accusatory, just watching with those careful eyes and that small face, cataloging something she was too young to fully name. She thought about what it meant that an 8-year-old had looked at her with more clarity than she had managed herself. She started typing. Not to HR this time, not to legal. She typed a meeting request with 3 recipients: Elliot Graves, Patricia Wellman from legal, and herself. She was going to fix this. Not because it was strategic, not because Bridget had outlined a smarter play, because she had read the gas station receipt and understood what it meant that on the worst night of her recent memory, a man she didn't know had pulled over twice and bought her water and kept the receipt not to document his heroism, but to document his accountability. And she had repaid that with the full institutional weight of everything she could deploy against him. The meeting was set for 9 the next morning. She closed the laptop and looked at her apartment, the clean lines of it, the deliberate absence of clutter, the space that looked the way it did because she had learned to need very little so that very little could be taken. She had built a life that was hard to damage from the outside by keeping it empty enough that there wasn't much to damage. Daniel Marsh had a cactus on his desk that had survived 3 years. He had a mug his daughter had painted. He had a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket with a crayon drawing on it, and she knew this not from the investigation file, but from the fraction of a second when she had watched him reach into his pocket in the hallway and touch something there, the unconscious contact of a man confirming that the important things were still where he had put them. She had been trying to protect herself from someone who had nothing in common with the person she'd been afraid of. She had known this since Saturday morning, standing in his living room with the note in her hand, and the light coming through his kitchen window, and the evidence of his actual life surrounding her on every surface. She had known it and chosen Bridget's fear over her own eyes, and the choosing had set something in motion that she was only now beginning to understand the full weight of. Outside her window, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in November, pressing forward with its gray, specific persistence, unmoved by individual reckonings. She watched the city for a while. Then she got up, put on her coat for the first time in 3 days, and went to find coffee that she had not made herself, because some things required leaving the apartment, and she had been in here long enough. The unknown number sent one more message to Daniel's phone on day 9 of his suspension. Not a photograph this time, just a sentence. 6 words arriving at 2 in the afternoon when he was sitting at his kitchen table with the evidence file open in front of him and Nora at school and the apartment very quiet around him. How does it feel being helpless? He read it twice. Then he set the phone face down, opened the section of the file he had been building on Warren's stills, and added the message with its timestamp to the record. He did not respond. He did not call the unknown number. He did not try to locate Warren or confront him or do any of the things that would have felt satisfying for approximately 30 seconds and then become new problems in an already complicated situation. He added it to the file. He closed the file. He started making dinner for when Nora came home. The helplessness was real. He was not going to perform his way out of it. He was not going to argue it into being something more manageable. A system was moving at its own pace for its own reasons, and his role in that system right now was to wait with the evidence and the documentation and the flat, certain knowledge of his own innocence which had never felt less like enough and had also never stopped being all he had. He was chopping onions when it occurred to him that he had not yet watched the video Mrs. Dunbar had sent him the night of Nora's performance. It was still on his phone, unopened. He had been waiting for the right moment, some quiet evening, when he could sit with it properly, when he could feel proud instead of guilty when watching Nora sing to an audience that didn't include him wouldn't cost him something he wasn't sure he could afford to spend right now. He kept chopping. He left the video unopened. Some things you carried until you were ready. Some things you put in your pocket and touched in the dark to confirm they were still there and waited for the moment when opening them would feel like receiving something rather than losing it all over again. The onions were a reasonable explanation for the rest. The meeting request arrived in Elliot Graves' calendar at 7:43 in the morning, which meant Claire Weston had sent it before she left her apartment, which meant she had been awake and decided before most of the building had filled. Elliot read it twice, forwarded it to Patricia Wellman with a 2-word message, "She's moving," and spent the next 40 minutes preparing for a conversation that had no established protocol because CEOs did not typically insert themselves into investigations they had initiated. Patricia Wellman arrived at the conference room first. She was 53, had been the company's chief legal officer for 11 years, and had the particular quality of someone who had seen enough situations resolve badly to have developed a durable skepticism about situations resolving well. She reviewed the investigation summary on her tablet and said nothing when Elliot came in, and said nothing when Claire arrived 2 minutes after that. Claire sat down without preliminary. She opened the folder she had brought and placed a document on the table. Her signature was at the bottom. She had signed it before coming, which told Elliot something about the quality of her certainty. "I'm withdrawing my initial report." Her voice carried the specific steadiness of someone who had rehearsed not for confidence but for clarity. "I've reviewed all available evidence. Based on what I've seen, I don't believe any misconduct occurred." Patricia picked up the document. Read it with the thoroughness she applied to everything, her expression moving through no visible register. Elliot looked at Claire directly. Ms. Weston, once a report is filed, the company has an obligation to investigate regardless of the complainant's position. Withdrawing doesn't terminate the process. I understand that. I'm not asking you to stop the investigation. I'm asking you to include my corrected statement in the record and to lift Mr. Marsh's suspension immediately pending whatever final review you need to complete. Patricia set down the document. If we reinstate him now and something surfaces later, the liability exposure becomes significantly more complex. Claire looked at Patricia with an expression that was not unkind and not soft. The liability exposure from keeping an innocent man suspended while his daughter is being told her father did something wrong at school by other children is also significant. It just doesn't appear in the columns you're measuring. The conference room held its particular institutional quiet. I filed that report because I was afraid. She said it without apparent difficulty, the way you said things you had spent enough time with, that they had stopped being shameful and become simply true. I woke up in a situation I didn't understand, and I did what I was trained to do: protect myself first, control the narrative. I was wrong. The evidence is unambiguous. Daniel Marsh did nothing except help someone who needed help, and because of my fear he has spent weeks watching his life come apart. A pause, measured and intentional. I am prepared to accept whatever internal review the company determines is appropriate for my handling of this, but I will not let my mistake finish what it started when I have the standing to stop it. Patricia and Elliot exchanged the look of people who had been in the same institution long enough to communicate without speaking. It was not an agreeable look. It was the look of people recalculating. We'll need to bring this to the full HR committee. Elliot gathered the document carefully. Discuss it quickly. Claire closed her folder. Every day that passes costs him something you can't reimburse. She left without waiting for the meeting to formally conclude. Elliot sat for a moment after the door closed, looking at the document in his hands. Patricia said nothing. Outside the conference room windows, the city went about its morning with its customary indifference to individual reckonings. In the days that followed, Warren Stills became a footnote rather than a chapter, but a footnote that required closing. The company's security team had been working the unknown number since Daniel reported it in week 2, and by the time Claire's corrected statement entered the record, they had already confirmed the source. Warren's resentment had been a simple machine running on a simple fuel, and when Daniel was reinstated and the investigation closed with no findings, the leverage Warren had been holding evaporated. There was nothing left to ignite. The security team documented it, passed it to legal, and legal sent a letter. Warren Stills disappeared back into whatever life he had built after being let go, smaller now than the shadow he had briefly cast. Daniel received the email on a Thursday afternoon, sitting at his kitchen desk with Nora at school and the apartment quiet around him. He read the reinstatement letter twice. Full back pay, no adverse notation. Return to his position, effective immediately. He set his laptop aside and looked at the wall for a while, at Nora's drawings, at the specific geography of a child's imagination rendered in crayon and tape. The cactus on the windowsill caught the thin afternoon light with its customary indifference to circumstance. He was not sure what he felt with enough precision to name it. Not relief, exactly. Not the clean satisfaction of vindication which implied that the correctness of an outcome retroactively justified the cost of reaching it. Something more complex and less comfortable than either the specific sensation of putting down something heavy that your body had reorganized around, where the absence of the weight was its own kind of adjustment. He called Mrs. Dunbar. She said good with the emphasis of someone releasing a held opinion. He thanked her. She told him to stop talking and go buy something decent for Nora's dinner. He said he would. He sat for another 10 minutes before he moved. He had been right. He had documented everything. He had waited. The outcome was what he had said it would be. And none of that returned the weeks to him or restored the specific damage done to Nora's sense of her father's reliability in the world, or gave him back the night he had lain on her floor in the dark, knowing that innocence and safety were different categories with a gap between them that could swallow a person whole. He had survived the gap. That was the actual achievement, smaller and more durable than vindication, harder to celebrate, impossible to dismiss. He put on his jacket and went to buy Nora something good for dinner. Walking back into the building on Friday morning required a specific interior preparation that Daniel accomplished by arriving early and entering without ceremony. He signed in at the front desk, took the elevator, walked to his desk. The cactus went back on the corner. Nora's photograph went back in its place. The painted mug went beside the computer. These reinstallations took 90 seconds and were observed by everyone within eyeline who was pretending not to observe them. Theo appeared within 4 minutes, moving with the speed of someone who had been watching the elevator. He sat at the edge of Daniel's desk and looked at him directly and said nothing for a moment. "I should have—" "Don't." Daniel pulled up his email. "You didn't do anything wrong. I told you that and I meant it. The photo was taken by someone trying to help me." He looked at Theo steadily. "The fact that it got used differently isn't on you. It's on the situation." Theo sat with this the way he sat with things he hadn't fully accepted but recognized he needed to. He nodded once the motion of someone filing something under unresolved, but set aside, and stood up and went back to his desk. The morning began its mechanics. The building resumed its rhythms around Daniel as though he had never left, and also as though he had, and he let both things be true simultaneously because that was what they were. The whispers had not stopped. He understood this from the way certain conversations developed gaps when he entered rooms, from the careful politeness that was performing normalcy rather than experiencing it. A few colleagues said things directly brief, genuine, the words of people who had revised something and wanted him to know. He received those with the same equanimity he applied to the silences. The paper said one thing. The institution was working out how to catch up to the paper. That would take the time it would take. The parent meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the school's small auditorium, the same room, the same stage, the same folding chairs. Daniel arrived early and sat in the third row and watched the space fill with the parents of Nora's classmates, most of whom arranged themselves with the unconscious social geometry of people who had positions to maintain. He told them everything, not a defense, not a strategic presentation, everything. The corporate dinner, Claire at the bar, the decision, the note, the floor of Nora's room, Mrs. Dunbar as witness. Theo's photograph, the investigation. The suspension, Nora coming home with what Marcus had said, the weeks of documentation, Warren stills, and the messages from the unknown number that the company's security team had traced and closed. The reinstatement letter, the specific, unambiguous conclusion of the investigation. He told them because Nora deserved to have the true version of this story exist in the room where the false one had been living. Not just in his personnel file here in this auditorium among these people whose children shared a classroom with his daughter. "I'm not asking you to forgive something that didn't happen," he said at the end. "I'm asking you not to punish my daughter for something her father didn't do." The room was quiet in a way that was different from how it had been when he started. Then the back door opened. She walked in without announcement. A simple dark coat, flat shoes, her hair down, none of the professional architecture she typically moved through the world in. She came to the front of the room and stood beside him, not touching, and the murmur that moved through the auditorium broke against her stillness and subsided. The past weeks had changed something in how she carried herself. Not diminished, recalibrated. The authority was still there, but it was no longer the first thing in the room. There was something underneath it now that hadn't been visible before, or that she hadn't let be visible. "My name is Claire Weston." Steady fully itself. "I'm the person Daniel Marsh helped that night, and I'm the person who filed the report that turned his life into what you've been hearing about." She waited while the room processed this. Then, "I filed that report because I was afraid. I woke up in a situation I couldn't account for, and I made the choice. I had been trained to make protect yourself first, don't let someone else write the first version of your story." Her eyes moved across the front rows, meeting faces directly. "I was wrong. Not because the instinct was irrational. Because I had evidence in front of me that I chose not to trust, and I converted an institutional process into a weapon against a man who had done nothing except exactly what I should have thanked him for." She paused. One decision made in fear by someone with institutional power can take a family apart. I almost took this one apart. Mr. Marsh's daughter deserves to come to this school without caring what I caused." She picked up the folder she had carried in and set it on the table at the front of the room. The full investigation file, the reinstatement letter visible on top. "This is what actually happened. I can't undo what I did. But the truth belongs in this room." She turned and walked out without waiting for questions, without anything further. The door closed behind her. The auditorium held its silence for a long moment. Daniel stood at the front and felt the quality of the quiet shifting, not to warmth, not immediately, but to something that had not been present when he walked in. The beginning of revision. The moment when the accurate version of a story entered a room and the inaccurate version had to move over and make space. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was acknowledgement arriving in the specific form of a room full of people who had been given a true thing and were now responsible for what they did with it. He ran into her in the elevator 11 days later. Neither of them had arranged it. The building had its habits, and one of its habits was placing people in the same car at inconvenient moments. The doors closed. She looked at the floor numbers. He looked at the floor numbers. Then, "Thank you," and he said it without requiring her to receive it as more than what it was. For the meeting. For the corrected statement. She kept her eyes on the display. "I should not have filed it in the first place." "You were scared." She turned to look at him. He met her gaze without performance. "That's very generous," her voice carrying something between acknowledgement and skepticism, "considering what it cost you." "It's not generous." He thought about how to say the true thing accurately. Fear makes people react in ways they wouldn't choose. What matters is what you do after the fear passes. You did something after it passed. A pause. "That's not nothing." The elevator reached her floor. The doors opened. She stepped out and then stopped, one hand resting against the doorframe, and looked back at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. Gratitude sitting alongside something harder. The look of someone who had learned something at a price they were still calculating. "Your daughter," she said. "Is she okay?" "She's getting there." He held her gaze. "Kids are resilient, especially the ones who have someone showing up for them." She nodded once the motion of someone receiving something they needed to hear for reasons they would sort through privately. She let the door go and walked down the corridor. He watched the doors close. He stood in the empty car as it continued upward and let the conversation settle into its proper proportion. Not a reconciliation, not a friendship forming. Two people who had seen each other at the precise worst moment and had chosen separately and at different costs to move forward from it. The respect between them was cold and specific and real, the kind that got built from difficulty rather than goodwill. And it would probably stay exactly that shape for as long as they worked in the same building. He could live with that. He had learned to distinguish between the outcomes he wanted and the outcomes that were actually available, and to find the floor beneath his feet in the gap between them. The spring concert fell on a Friday evening in early April. Daniel arrived 20 minutes early, walked down the center aisle, and sat in the seat directly in front of the stage. He had Nora's drawing in his jacket pocket, the crayon figures, the careful capitals, the paper worn soft from months of being carried. He had not taken it out and looked at it since November. He had only touched it sometimes in the dark to confirm it was still there. The auditorium filled. He recognized some of the parents from the Thursday meeting. A few met his eyes and nodded the nod of people who had revised something and were indicating it without ceremony. He nodded back. Nora appeared in the lineup of children filing onto the stage and scanned the audience with the focused efficiency of someone looking for a specific face. She found him in approximately 4 seconds. Her expression broke open, not performed, the actual thing, uncontained, the smile of a child who had been carrying uncertainty for months and was setting it down all at once. He raised one hand. Small. Exactly for her. She took her place in the lineup, still smiling, and he watched her shoulders settle into the particular posture of someone who has confirmed the one thing they needed to confirm and can now do what they came to do. The concert proceeded. Her class sang 3 songs. On the second, the high part came, the one she had been practicing, the one she had told him about with the careful understatement of someone who didn't want to seem like they were asking for reassurance. She hit it. Not perfectly, the note arriving with the slight breathiness of someone giving everything available to them, but fully with commitment, the voice of a child who had decided to trust the moment. He watched her face in the half-second after she landed it, the private flicker of recognition that she had done the thing she'd been afraid she couldn't. Nobody else in the auditorium necessarily caught it. It was a small thing, internal, passing across her expression and gone. He caught it because he had been paying attention to Nora's face for 8 years and had learned to read the vocabulary of it. When the children came off the stage into the waiting crowd, Nora moved through the room with purpose and arrived in front of him, and he caught her, and she was entirely herself against him. The full weight, the arms around his neck, the quality of relief that only exists in people who had genuinely considered another outcome. "You came," her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I told you I would." "I know." She pulled back to look at him with the specific assessment she reserved for confirming things she had chosen to believe. "But you really came." He held her face in both hands for a moment, looked at her directly. This close, he could see that the gap in her smile was almost filled, the new tooth nearly complete. The piratical quality almost resolved his daughter becoming the next version of herself, the way she always was, incrementally, and without waiting for him to be ready. "I really came," he said. She held his gaze for one more second, completing whatever internal accounting she was conducting. Then she wriggled free and turned to find her friends, because she was 8 years old and she had done the hard thing, and now she wanted to be 8 years old about it, loudly and among her peers. He watched her go and felt something in his chest complete a circuit that had been open since November. He stayed in his seat while the auditorium emptied around him, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to sit in the room for another minute. The stage was empty now, the lights dimming back to their maintenance level, the folding chairs already being stacked at the edges by a custodian working with quiet efficiency. This was the same room where Nora had stood in November and scanned the front row and found it empty. The same stage, the same particular quality of school auditorium air. He sat in it and let it be both things at once, the place where he had failed and the place where he had shown up, because that was what it was, and pretending otherwise would have cost him something he was no longer willing to spend on comfortable fictions. Mrs. Dunbar appeared beside him with Nora's coat and backpack, and a look that conveyed several things without requiring any of them to be spoken. He stood up, took the backpack. "You did right by her," Mrs. Dunbar said. "Not about tonight specifically, about all of it." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I'm still working out whether the right thing and the fair thing are ever the same thing." She considered this with the patience of someone who had been alive long enough to have an informed opinion. "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. But sometimes that's enough." She went to find Nora. He stood alone in the nearly empty auditorium for one more moment. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded drawing, pressed it flat against his palm, the crayon figures slightly faded now, the careful capitals still legible. "Seat number 1, reserved for Daddy." He had carried this through everything, the suspension and the cardboard box and the savings math and the nights on the kitchen table with the evidence file. It had been in his pocket every day, available to confirm that there was something on the other side of the difficulty worth walking toward. He folded it carefully along its original crease and put it back, not in his wallet this time, in the interior pocket of his jacket, closer where he would feel it when he breathed. He walked out of the auditorium into the April evening, where Nora was already on the sidewalk, demonstrating something enthusiastically to 2 of her friends, her coat half on her performance costume still sparkling faintly under the streetlights. She looked up when she heard him coming and waved with the casual confidence of someone who had confirmed all necessary facts and was now fully occupied with the present. He waved back. The city was doing what it did in April. Tentative warmth, the particular smell of Chicago when it finally decided to stop resisting the season, the streets carrying their ordinary Friday evening weight of people going toward things they wanted. He stood on the sidewalk outside his daughter's school with the drawing against his ribs and the April air on his face, and let the ordinary settle around him like something earned, not the absence of cost. The cost had been real, and some of it was permanent, and he was not going to perform his way to the conclusion that it wasn't. But the ordinary was also real. Nora's voice carrying across the sidewalk, the specific weight of the folded paper against his chest, the evening opening in front of them like something that belonged to them specifically. He had done the right thing. The right thing had required a price he had not budgeted for and could not have fully anticipated. He had paid it. He was still paying some of it in the ways that damage settled into the body and became part of how it moved through the world. He would keep paying it in small ways for a while. And he was standing outside his daughter's spring concert on a Friday in April with the drawing she had made for him still in his pocket, because some things you carried, not because they were light, but because they were worth the weight. Nora finished her conversation with her friends and jogged over to him, her backpack bouncing her coat finally fully on. She fell into step beside him the way she always did, naturally, without negotiation, as though his side were simply where she belonged. "Can we get pancakes?" She looked up at him. "It's 7:30 on a Friday." "That's exactly when pancakes are appropriate." He looked down at her. She looked up at him. The gap in her smile was almost closed, the new tooth nearly in his daughter arriving at her next self whether he was ready or not. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They walked toward the car together in the April evening, father and daughter, the city going about its ordinary business around them, and Daniel Marsh did not look back at the school or forward at whatever came next. He was here on this sidewalk with this specific person beside him, the front row, exactly where he had promised to be. That was enough. That was, it turned out, the whole answer.